Hi everyone, a very warm welcome to this talk video. Again, just me, Hirsch Saha, reporting from Auckland, New Zealand, and today is the 21st of April, 2024. Onto today's topic, one that's fascinated me since I was a very young child, and that's the law of outer space. And this talk video is actually part one of two parts about the law of outer space. And yeah, I thought I'd just sort of start off with a bit of background. I think a lot of people ask about outer space. We hear about in terms of the moon landing and probes that have been sent to Mars. And also coming up to the modern day, we hear about it in terms of what NASA is doing today. With sending probes to where they're sending them to. We might be reminded of the Hubble telescope that was sent up, I think, in 1990. And then, of course, you hear of very wealthy individuals such as Elon Musk with his SpaceX company, which is focused on colonizing Mars, and then Jeff Bezos, another very wealthy individual who started Amazon, and he is focusing on potentially colonizing the moon. So, just thought, would start off with a bit of background. Some people might ask, why outer space? Why would you want to go to outer space considering how expensive it is, how dangerous, risky it is? Why would you want to live in outer space when you're so far away from everyone else? Why should we even, go to outer space? Is it, should we do that? I know some people might argue whether it's our right to even conquer those, that space or that area or those other planets or planetary bodies, or asteroids, what have you. But even if you agree that, we can do whatever we want because there seems to be no one else who's going to do anything with them, um, why should we? Why should we? Don't we have enough here on Earth? Isn't it easier to stay right here on Earth? When you don't need a spacesuit to go outside, when again it's not so risky, it's not so dangerous. I remember reading a book saying that, oh, even Earth plus 4 degrees warming, which unfortunately I hate to admit could be a future for this planet with the way things are going or with business as usual. Even Earth with plus 4 degrees warming, some people would argue is still way better than, living on the moon or living on Mars or living on the space station or living in outer space, right? But no, still, believe it or not, there are a lot of advantages to be gained from, going out into space, exploring space, and of course, colonizing space. There are a lot of advantages to doing so, and a lot of wealth and technology, and also economic activity in terms of jobs and business, that can be gained from it. And not just what you see and do in outer space, but the effects it has right down here on Earth. So a lot can be gained, and there are some very credible reasons for doing so. But I thought I'd just start off with a very basic history. I think it's amazing our knowledge of space has dramatically increased, especially in the last sort of 60 to 70 years when the space race had begun between the United States and the former Soviet Union, which was around about, I think it was in the late 40s, just after the Cold War between the two superpowers of the world at the time, just after that Cold War started. Our knowledge of space has increased, exponentially in that time. And, as they say, we now know more about the surface of the moon than the depths of our oceans, which is probably actually not a very good thing, but at least we do know so much about the moon. But I guess starting from more or less the very beginning, of course, man has looked up at the stars since the very beginning of time. But I guess but after that, a tad more recently, I think it was Ptolemy, the scientist Ptolemy in the Middle Ages, who said that he thought the Earth was at the center of the solar system and all the other planets revolved around it, including the sun. And then it was Copernicus who said, no, actually, no, the sun is at the center of the solar system, and all the planets, including Earth, revolve around it. And of course, now we know that to be true. Basically, the Earth rotates, keeps going around the sun, the moon goes around the Earth, all the planets go around the sun, and the sun itself keeps going, if you like, around in our galaxy known as the Milky Way, which is massive, approximately 100,000 light years across. And light being basically the fastest moving thing we know about, travels at, I think it's 180,000 miles per second, or about 300,000 kilometers per second, very, very fast. To give you an idea, it only takes light 8 minutes to reach us from the sun. But the whole sense of light years is basically if you say that the Milky Way is 100,000 light years across, it means that it takes light 100,000 years to go from one end of the Milky Way to the other. You can calculate how far it is. If light travels at, say, 180,000 miles per second or 300,000 kilometers per second, how far is 100,000 light years? As they say, much larger than the human mind can even imagine. And it's interesting. They say like some of the stars we look up to in our night sky could actually be gone by now because it's taken so long for the light from the stars to reach us that by now they could have been gone. It really makes you think. Um, Again, something a bit closer, the sun. It takes light 8 years to reach us. I'm sorry, 8 minutes to reach us from there. So it's interesting when you look up at the sun. Of course, don't look directly at it, but when you do look up at the sun, you're seeing it as it was 8 minutes ago. So yeah, I think it was Ptolemy who said that the Earth was at the center of the solar system with the other planets and the sun revolving around it. Then Copernicus who said no, the sun is at the center of the solar system with all the planets, including Earth, revolving or orbiting it, which we know is correct. And then it was Galileo who took it further and turned a telescope up to the night sky and observed many things. And I think he observed many of the planets in our solar system and even named them. And as you know, many of the planets in our solar system, I think it's actually all of them, except for Earth, are named after ancient Greek gods and goddesses. I think Venus known as the named after the goddess of beauty. Mars was named after the god of war because of its sort of rusty red color, and its two moons known as Phobos and Deimos are the Greek words for fear and terror, which is quite interesting. But yeah, so I think it was in the 1800s. It was a Russian who first managed to send a rocket up. I'm not sure if I don't think it reached not quite space, but managed to send a rocket up very high. And as you know, the thing with rockets is just basically they tend to be sort of long building like structures, long thin structures, and most of them are full of fuel, and of course they've got the blasters, their engines and blasters at the bottom. And basically how they go is you actually tend to have sort of one rocket on top of another. If you think of the Saturn V rocket, part of the United States Apollo mission, they sent men to the moon back in 1969, or basically I think it was 9 missions from 1969 to 1972, and as far as records go, official records, no one has been to the moon since then, since December 1972, which was Apollo 17. Apollo 11 was the first one to successfully reach the moon. Apollo 13 had trouble on its way and wanted to land, but was unable to land on the moon. But I think it still got to the moon and orbited it before coming back. But basically, as you know, rockets, think of those sort of thin, structures, a bit like a building or a long metallic tube. And basically, what happens is that, escaping Earth is quite hard because of its strong gravity. And first of all, the parts that they're made of, they're known as stages. At the bottom, stage one, then say stage two, then stage three, and then the bit at the top, which is actually what's sent into space, is known as the payload. And basically, as they ascend, by shooting out, hot gas, thrust from the bottom, they push themselves upwards. And basically, that bottom part of the rocket, or the first stage, eventually exhausts itself and then drops away. And then the second stage lights up. And then it goes until it's used all its fuel to carry, the rocket even further into the sky and towards space until its fuel is exhausted. Then it drops away and it keeps going until you have the payload, which basically will be on its own by the time it reaches space and then go from there. And basically, from the ground, or if you like, from sea level to space, is about 100 kilometers on Earth. And when space starts, that's I think, known as the Kármán line. And I know that on the ground, first going up, you've got the troposphere, basically with a lot of the clouds. That's where planes fly. Then going up, I think it's the stratosphere, then mesosphere, ionosphere, and exosphere. I'm not sure if that's absolutely correct or in the right order, but it's pretty much like that. But I think the main thing to know is that it's 100 kilometers from sea level pretty much to space, and that's where space begins and the Earth's atmosphere ends. And as you know, the Earth's atmosphere is just gas, mostly nitrogen, also some oxygen, and most of it is down here. I think it's about 95% of the volume of our atmosphere is within about 30% of the way from sea level to space, which means the remaining 5% of the volume of the atmosphere is distributed with the remaining 70% of the height from of the remaining height from here sea level to space. And what's known as low Earth orbit is what's quite interesting is that say you fire a rocket or anything from the ground, if you fire it with a weak strength, it'll just go up and fall back to the ground. If you fire it, with a high enough, if you fire with a very powerful upthrust, then of course it'll escape the Earth's gravity and ascend into space. But at just the right amount of power and at just the right height from Earth, more or less, it will enter what's called low Earth orbit. And while space begins at 100 k's up, low Earth orbit is about 200 k's up. And that's where some satellites do roam. I don't think many satellites, but that's where some satellites can roam. And that's basically where, as you fall, it's interesting, you fall at the same rate that the Earth curves. So you basically keep on falling at the same rate as the Earth curves and then basically orbit the Earth. But eventually you'll come down. And I think it's usually the higher something is in space, the longer it will remain there. So low Earth orbit is about 200 k's up, and then you've got what's called geosynchronous or geostationary orbit, which is actually you're high enough above the Earth that you will end up orbiting the Earth at the same rate that the Earth itself rotates. That means you'll basically always stay at this above the exact same spot on the Earth, and that geosynchronous or geostationary orbit is about I think it's about 36 or 37,000 K, so it's a bit further. It's about 36 or 37,000 Ks above sea level, and that's where a lot of satellites actually do comfortably sit, and they keep sitting at the exact same spot above the Earth. And of course, they're very good for relaying telecommunications signals from say one spot on Earth to the other, as the Earth, of course, curves. So coming back to the space race, basically, as you know, the end of World War II, after the Nazis were defeated, thank God, by the Russia, the US, the British, all the Allies, you had two remaining superpowers, being the United States and the Soviet Union. So this is 1945. After that, what began was basically known historically as the Cold War, and it's amazing how long it went for. It lasted all the way until Christmas 1991. So this is now in probably most of our lives, whereas 1945 wouldn't be. Christmas 1991 is really not a hell of a long time ago, and that's of course officially when the Soviet Union collapsed. And kind of interesting, they collapsed on Christmas 1991, celebrating the birth of Jesus Christ, when communists usually don't, believe in religion. It's pretty, what I've always thought it was quite an interesting point. So after 1945, the United States and the Soviet Union, pretty much at the beginning of the Cold War, engaged in basically a race of technology because each wanted to rule the world and spread, their ideology to the rest of the world, whether it was capitalism or communism. And what happened is that the space race had basically begun, and NASA was established pretty much to, defeat the Soviet Union. And it's very interesting. And I know this sort of goes back to another talk video I spoke about. I gave quite a while ago, the value of hard work. But what I've always found very interesting is that the United States, after World War II, they really got a lot of the famous Nazi scientists, scientists who worked under Hitler's Nazi regime, under his Nazi empire. In particular, Werner von Braun. He was an ex-Nazi who moved to America after World War II and began to work on their space program. And the reason why they captured a lot of the Nazi scientists was because those scientists worked on basically Hitler's, if you like, weapons of mass destruction, in particular his missiles. Werner von Braun himself worked on Hitler's V2 missile, V for vengeance. Of course, Hitler thought he, deserved to have a lot of, revenge against so many people that he just blamed for everything, which of course, had nothing to do with it. And you might notice that the science behind missiles and rockets is actually quite similar. Missiles go horizontally and are supposed to unfortunately kill people, whereas rockets go vertically and are supposed to send payloads into space. But the science behind them is quite similar. So the Americans had grabbed a lot of Nazi scientists, and of course this is not a very ethical point, but known as Project Paperclip, if I'm correct. They said to the Nazi scientists, don't worry what you did during World War II, how many people you helped facilitate the, horrible murders of, such as in the concentration camps. We want you to work on our space program. We want you to work for us. We'll pay your rite of passage to the US. We'll give you American citizenship and a job. And so the Americans had a lot of the Nazi scientists. Not only that, but they had facilities and they had wealth. The Russians, the Soviet Union, on the other hand, didn't have much at all. They were working on their space program in Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan, the reason for that is because when you're sending rockets into space, the closer you are to the equator, the easier it is, which is why, of course, America sent the rockets for its Apollo moon missions from Cape Canaveral in Florida, being one of its southernmost points, one of the southernmost points of the country and therefore the closest to the equator. So Russia used Kazakhstan, being one of its southernmost points or closest to the equator. So they had their space program in Kazakhstan, and they were so poor in the beginning that they were using cardboard boxes as desks. Can you believe that? And even though the Soviet Union didn't have Werner von Braun and other Nazi scientists and the facilities and the wealth, they did have Sergei Korolev. And Sergei Korolev was from Russia, and he was a very, very hard worker and very intelligent when it came to space, and he genuinely wanted to colonize space. He loved it. The poor guy, unfortunately, had spent 20 years in a horrible Russian gulag, and I don't know how he survived it, but he survived it. He lived to tell the tale and then work on the Russian space program, and he was known as a chief architect of the Russian space program. So, what happened is that even though the Russians were at a disadvantage, they didn't have the Nazi scientists, the facilities, and the wealth. It's amazing what they accomplished. They had the first satellite in space, Sputnik, launched in 1957. The Americans obviously didn't like that, and they tried to send their satellite in space afterwards. And you might laugh at this, but when they launched their satellite, the rocket went, from what I read, only a few feet up in the air, and then just immediately started to come down. The little satellite at the top broke off and fell down, and when it came down, the whole thing just burst into flames. And the media had a real the media had a real field day with that. They called it Kaputnik. Just like Russia's first satellite was called Sputnik, America's first one, which failed, was called Kaputnik, and there were many other names such as Flopnik and all that. But Kaputnik really stuck. So amazing what the Russians started off with much less, but seem to have achieved much more. It's amazing the value of hard work, like I said in that other talk video. So they had the first satellite in space, Sputnik, in 1957, and then they beat the Americans again. They had the first man in space, Yuri Gagarin, and that was on the 12th of April, 1961. And he spent I think it was about 109 minutes in space. He orbited the whole world, and he came back, and he successfully landed back in the Soviet Union, where he parachuted to safety. And of course, the Americans didn't like that either. They did have their first man in space, which was Alan Shepard. Yes, Alan Shepard was their first man in space, but it was the following month, May 1961, and he didn't complete a full orbit around Earth, taking 109 minutes. He only went, he only went up for about 15 or 20 minutes in just a suborbital hop, basically up and then down, up just into space and then down again. But technically, it was a man in space, the first American in space, the second man in space on the Earth. The Russians would forever hold, the achievement, the title of having the first man in space, Yuri Gagarin, 1961. And it went on. The Russians had the first manned spacewalk, which is basically when they not only go in space, but they exit the spacecraft and actually float into space, tethered, for breathing air, but actually float into space and basically walk in space, sometimes known as an EVA or an extravehicular activity. So the Russians had the first manned spacewalk as well. They had the first woman in space. I think that was 1965. They had the first probe to the moon to land on the moon, the first probe to the dark side of the moon, the first probe to Venus, which managed to take just one picture of the ground before the probe, I think, collapsed under Venus's intense temperature and atmospheric pressure. Its temperature is extremely hot, I think at about 500 degrees approximately, and its atmospheric pressure is about 100 times as much as it is on Earth. Just like Mars's atmospheric pressure is about 100 times less as it is on Earth. So they had sent the first probe to Venus. The first probe to Mars, even though I think it crashed, I think, or went straight into a storm, but I think it still was technically the first probe to land on Mars. I think it worked for about 20 seconds before it failed, but at least first probe to land on Mars. So the Russians had a lot of firsts. And after Yuri Gagarin was the first man in space in April 1961, of course, I'd really got the Americans going. And that's when you had President John F. Kennedy at the time give his famous speech. I think it was at Rice University. I believe this nation should commit itself. And he says, "We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard." And he says, I believe this nation should commit itself of achieving the goal of sending the first man to the moon before this decade is out and returning him to Earth safely. And that was obviously a very, very ambitious endeavor at the time. People thinking, oh my God, you just sent a man into space, but just, 15, 20 minutes, and you're talking about sending a man to the moon, to land on the moon. The moon, which is about 380,000 kilometers away from Earth. Obviously going to take time to get there, and you want him to land on the moon and be able to come back up and return to Earth, and of course survive for all that time. People wondered if it was impossible at the time, but he set the record in April 1961, and of course he gave the deadline, basically being before this decade is out, 31st December 1969. And as you know, the Americans set to work on that, and of course they had a lot of hurdles on the way. The Russians sort of kept advancing, and I know the Americans were able to send. First, actually, they had a bit of a setback in 1967 with Apollo 1. It was actually, they were doing a test on the ground, and because people were in the small rocket, and because it was full of oxygen, obviously for them to breathe, but there were at the same time wires within the rocket that were exposed. I think a leak, or what they believe was a leak in the wire, exposing electricity, unfortunately ignited that oxygen, and there was fire, and it killed all three men in Apollo 1 and the Apollo 1 test capsule immediately, including Gus Grissom. So that was a huge setback for the Americans, and that was in 1967, but they were still determined to get there. In 1968, I think around Christmas 1968, they did manage to send three men to the moon, as far as the moon, but orbiting it, not landing, and then of course returning. And then, as the official records go, as we know, on 20th of July 1969, the Americans landed on the moon, two men, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin, while the third man, Michael Collins, remained up, in the lunar module, which orbited the moon. And while Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin descended to the moon, walked out of their, what is known as the Eagle. Some people may remember the line on the news, the Eagle has landed. They walked out of the Eagle in their spacesuits, put down the flag, laid footprints, surveyed a lot of the outside, took some sample rocks, and then went back in the Eagle module with the top half, the bottom half staying there, but the top half ascending into space, and then basically doing an orbit rendezvous or docking with the lunar module that Michael Collins was in, and then of course Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin crawling into the module, and then all three of them coming back to Earth, and then being dropped in, I think it was the North Pacific Ocean. So that's what happened. And I know, of course, there's conspiracy theories against that. Some people say it just seems very unrealistic that they were failing so hard, and then pretty much at the last minute they got there and just everything happened to go well and they came back. And people talk about inconsistencies with the photography of, the landing on the moon and all that. And it is arguable, but many people do think that when you look at it hard and you analyze evidence, it looks like they did get to the moon. Of course, we may never know for sure. Some conspiracy theorists say one way we can know for sure is that if we look at the areas where they landed and see, is the American flag still there? Are their footprints still there? Is the bottom part of the lunar landing module, the Eagle, is that still there? Because that was all abandoned. So I guess that's one way to do it. I'm not sure if they've actually done that even today, not even with probes or anything, but that's what some conspiracy theorists say. So in the end, it looks like the Americans had won the space race, although one part of it, which is not always detailed very well, is the Russian component of it. And the Russians were actually not far behind. They had planned to get to the moon, and actually, they had planned to get to the moon sooner. What the Soviet Union wanted to do was to reach the moon in October 1967. The reason why they set that deadline was because they wanted it to mark the 50th anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution, the revolution of communism in Russia, in October 1917. So imagine that, having the revolution in October 1917, and then at the end of World War II, ending up as a superpower, and then 50 years after that revolution, basically being as the leader of the world, as a superpower, but also the leader of technology, having reached the moon as well. That would have been an amazing achievement for them. But unfortunately, with the Soviet Union, things started to deteriorate. You had Sergei, and this is again the story which you don't hear as often as the American one. Sergei Korolev, his health had been deteriorating. You know, the leader of the Russian space program, Sergei Korolev, who I spoke of earlier, his health was deteriorating, and he started to get a tumor in his body, and in the end, it became a tumor the size of a fist. Jeez, poor guy, and I think that cut his life short. And he was also working too hard when he shouldn't have been working so hard because he was sick. So his health deteriorated, and also the government was not giving enough money for the Russian space program. You know, some argue had they given more money, they potentially could have achieved getting to the moon, and maybe even before the Americans did. Um, but then, of course, when the Americans had landed on the moon, it was a huge blow to the Soviet Union, and they pretty much stopped their space program. You know, stopped it there, especially when Sergei Korolev, his health had deteriorated, and the Americans, it looked like the Americans had won it. And it's kind of a sad story in some ways, but that's what had happened. Since then, since 1969, or actually no, the Americans continued space missions to the moon up until December 1972. In 1973, they sent up Skylab, which is basically their first, space station before the International Space Station. Unfortunately, after 1973, almost pretty much to the present day, to be honest, and to the time when you've now got private companies looking at space, such as Jeff Bezos, who did Amazon with his Blue Origin private company, or Elon Musk, who's also done Tesla and has SpaceX, and of course now you have other powerful countries who have space programs, such as China, Japan, France, India, and we know China sent up probes. India recently sent up a probe that landed on the south pole of the moon, known as Chandrayaan 3. Chandrayaan is Indian for moon vehicle. They sent up Chandrayaan 3 to the moon, south pole, just in August 2023. I think they sent up a probe to. Oh, stupid phone going. Let me get rid of that. I think they sent up a probe to Mars, and it was 2015. Chandrayaan 2, I think, was 2018, reaching the moon, or crashing into the moon, and Chandrayaan 1, which first reached the moon all the way back in 2008, and which was very successful and cost effective for India. So now you've got those other countries and those private companies now looking at space. But that's today. But between, say, 1973, when the Americans had done Skylab, and the present day, to be honest, not much has been done because NASA no longer having the Soviet Union as a competitor and having that goal of having to reach the moon before the end of the decade or a certain date. Unfortunately, they haven't done much, whereas they've still been given a lot of funding, and as a result, NASA has become quite corrupt. They've done some things, not a hell of a lot. They sent the probe Sojourner Pathfinder to Mars in 1997. They sent, I think it was a few other probes in 2003, 2004 to Mars. I think one was Curiosity. They sent a probe that landed on a Martian ice cap in 2008. They sent probes to other planets. They did the Hubble telescope in 1990, although it was such a big failure that there was a huge error in its lens. The images would have been returned blurry, and they had to actually go up and fix it in space, believe it or not. But more or less, they haven't really done anything sort of big, such as landing a moon on Mars or setting up a base on the moon, or starting interplanetary travel or anything like that. They really haven't done anything big. Of course, they keep saying they will, but now, of course, you've got the private companies that are onto it, and you've got other countries who are also onto it as well. And then that brings us to where we are today in, 21st of April 2023. It looks like space is again open for business, and that will lead me into my second video, part two. Um, of space. What space has to offer, and that'll be my next video talking about what it really does have to offer and why we should colonize it. And I think this is a pretty good point to start. Been running for almost half an hour, so that's the first part. Look forward to seeing you soon again for the second part. Thank you.